Hi, in this episode of The Art Biz, I talk with the author William Deresiewicz, who wrote The Death of the Artist. And I'm going to tell you the subtitle because the subtitle tells you all you need to know as an introduction to this episode. The subtitle is How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech. Please enjoy this conversation with Bill Deresiewicz. Hi, Bill. Welcome to The Art Biz.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I'm so glad you're here. So, Death of the Artist, The Death of the Artist came out in 2020, and that's when I bought it on iBooks. But then I guess I got busy pivoting during the pandemic like everyone else did and forgot that I bought it. And this year it came across my radar again. I got it from the library. I got a number of chapters in. I was like, I got to get my own copy because I was just dying to mark it up. So now I have the paperback. So I've had 3 versions of this book, which I don't recommend. I don't recommend because
but one would be good.
I scattered my notes and my thinking around them, but I just keep going back. But it is a book that I've recommended so many times to people. I think every artist should read it. It's packed with stories and anecdotes and facts and figures and statistics. Some really good lists that I love, like how many jobs an artist has had throughout
the day jobs list. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I love that.
I like that one a lot. Yes.
And there's so much here that I struggled with, where should we begin? What should we talk about? So I say at the front, y'all just need to read this book. Bill and I are going to talk about it a little bit, but it is loaded. So maybe just a little background on how you came across this topic.
Right. Let me say first that I really don't like the title, The Death of the Artist. And I worry especially that it's a turnoff for artists. But my publisher insisted on it because I guess it grabs people's attention. But the book is about what the internet has done to the arts economy for individual creators. And anyone who's an individual creator knows that it's transformed everything. I mean, it's economics, but it's beyond economics, like the fact that you have to be on the platforms all the time. I came to this book because when this whole thing first started, which was really with Napster in music, which I think was like 98 or 97. And all of a sudden music was free and musicians were screaming and, you're going to destroy our livelihood. And nobody wanted to hear it because everyone was so happy that music was free. And even young writers were starting to tell me about, oh, you don't understand, things are different now. It's all about exposure and you get exposure even if they don't pay you. And I was like, okay, but when do they pay you? And they didn't have an answer for that. And there was also all this kind of propaganda that was coming out of Silicon Valley, and a lot of journalists picked this up very uncritically about how this was going to enable everyone to be an artist, everyone to make a living as an artist, just put your stuff out there. And again, I had the same, I knew this was ridiculous. But, and some people were writing about this, and some people were writing, good books about this. But now a few years later, so when I really start to work on this book, which is already 2016, my question was not whether this was really going to hurt artists' livelihoods, because it seemed at least to me clear that it was. But given that it was, how were people doing it? How were people making a living in this new internet economy? How were artists? That means musicians, visual artists, writers, people who make film and television. And I figured the only way to find out is to ask a lot of people. So I ended up interviewing about 140 people, most of them artists, also, producers, editors, people like that, gallerists. And that's what the book is. So it's got a lot of facts and figures about the big picture, and a lot of stories of individual artists. Because one of the things I learned is that everybody does it their own way.
Oh, the stories are so diverse from artist to artist. And as I hear from my clients, I mean, no one has the same path. So, yeah.
Right. Right. That's one of the most important takeaways. And when I talk to young artists, usually in the context of like an art school class where I'm invited to talk, that's the thing I emphasize among more than almost anything else. Everybody has to find it's not like most careers, medicine or teaching, where it's basically there's a path or a few paths and they're laid out and everyone does the same. Every artist puts it together in their own way, usually from lots of little pieces.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. You're not going to just do one thing. You're going to do a lot of things.
Yeah. I want to read a quote from page 57 because this to me is something that I say to people all the time. And that is the good news is that you have the freedom to pursue the new opportunities. Or so the internet provides you with all these opportunities and you have the freedom to pursue it. The bad news is that everyone else does. The good news is that you can do it yourself. And the bad news is that you have to.
That's correct.
It's true. It's so true.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And as I frame it in the chapter, like, what's the state? This is the chapter about like the broad state of the arts economy. I say there's good news, there's bad news. I'm sorry. There's bad news, there's good news, and there's bad news about the good news. The bad news is so many things are free or they're cheap or people expect you to work for free. The good news is, yes, unprecedented opportunities. Amazing. All kinds of things that artists couldn't do before, like teaching classes online or something like that. Or things they could do before that are easier to do with the internet. And then the bad news about the good news is what you just read, which is everybody else has heard the good news. Everyone's trying to do it.
Yeah.
And also, yes, you can do it yourself. You don't have to have a gallery or a publisher or a label, but doing it yourself, which is so much of what the book is about, especially those little mini biographies, is really hard. And so basically you need to have two jobs now. You can't just, there's the artist job, there's the creating, and we all know how difficult that is. And then there's basically running a one-person small business job.
Nope, nobody else is going to do it. And what I tell my clients all the time is I remember the days, and some of my clients remember the days when the only option was to send a set of 35 millimeter slides to a gallery and hope that they loved your work. I mean, that's how you marketed your work 30 years ago. Like that was the only thing artists did. And there's so many options for artists to sell online from their websites, from lots of my clients. I know people that make a living selling from Instagram. It's doable, but it's unpalatable for a lot of artists. They really want that gallery to do all the work for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dream, and people are going to pursue that dream, but very few people get to do it. And I should also say that even those people who have galleries, or again, publishers if you're a writer, label if you're a musician, those entities expect you to do much more of the work than they used to. So you still have to do a lot of marketing. You still have to do a lot of promotion. Very often, whatever money you get from those channels, I mean, I would say not very often, but usually. Speaking as a writer who publishes with major New York publishing companies, that's not going to be, that's not going to be a living. That's not going to be a sufficient living. It could be a decent piece of it. But I mean, even artists who have galleries, my understanding is many of them, maybe most of them, I mean, they're not Jeff Koons, right? Most of them are still doing other things.
Yeah.
Selling work is great and it helps, but you're also teaching or maybe doing commercial work that you don't have your name on, or maybe doing work that's not related to your art at all.
And you still have to know the marketing and the promotions to get the gallery's attention in the first place. And unless you have that Jeff Koons gallery, is he at Gagosian? I'm not sure. But unless you have one of those top 4 galleries,
yes,
you need multiple galleries. So it's just like a never ending.
It's also true.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what people will often have galleries in, if they're successful, they'll have galleries in several, an LA gallery, New York gallery, maybe a London gallery. But I mean, you also touched on something really important. I said that even if you have a representation, you still have to do much more of the work than you used to have to do. Marketing, publicity, blah, blah, blah. But it's also true that representation is looking for you to come to them with an audience.
Yeah.
I mean, this is most obvious in music. I have a friend, one of the people I interviewed for the book is actually a very successful pop music producer. And his life has changed a lot because he used to find acts by going to clubs. His wife complained a lot because he was always working at night. That's not how it works anymore. Now you're looking for people who've already gained traction on the platforms by post self-producing and self-marketing their own stuff. Putting stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. It's kind of sad.
Yeah.
It's a lot less interesting for everybody, but it means you have to do that initial work yourself.
Yeah. Well, and authors are expected to have a platform.
Yes. Across the board. That's right. Depending on what art, if you're interested in making film, it's going to be shorts that you put on YouTube or some other visual platform. If you're a writer, I mean, maybe things have changed a little because of what's happened to Twitter, but it used to be all about Twitter and how big an audience you could build on Twitter and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. With artists, it's Instagram these days. So there is that. It's just, there is so much. I'm just blown away because this is the book I wish I had written, because it's like there's so many little tidbits that I've been telling artists, but to see it all come together is just so nice and horrifying and all that stuff all at once. Hi, Allison here, and I want to invite you to my premier art marketing and business building foundational program, Essentials for Artist Success. This program provides the fundamental tools and processes that you need to build a sustainable art business. It's for you if maybe you've been going through the motions of trying to build an art business, you're trying this and that, and you're now ready to actively engage in planning, analyzing, adjusting, and strategizing. Everything you learn in Essentials will serve you for years to come in your evolution as an artist. Check it out. It's at artbizsuccess.com/essentials. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing visual artists today, or artists in general, however you want to answer that?
Well, I will say that there is one big difference between a lot of visual artists and most of the artists I talk about. Because one of the biggest factors in terms of the internet economy for artists is digitization. So music can be digitized and writing can be digitized. Anything that can be digitized can be made free. And some visual artists, like comics artists and illustrators, photographers, have been destroyed by the internet. But if you're making painting and sculpture, at least your work cannot be converted to ones and zeros, and that gives you an advantage. But you still have all the other challenges. And I would say that the thing that comes to mind first is discoverability, right?
Yeah.
Because yes, the internet has drawn in, an order of magnitude, maybe more than an order of magnitude, number of new people into these fields. It didn't, it used to be, you go back 20 years, let alone 50 years. I mean, they say that in the early 60s, the entire New York art world could fit into one big room, and often did at parties or openings. There weren't that many serious painters in this country. And then the MFA programs ramped up, and it's great that people are making work. But now, you're contending with literally hundreds of thousands of other people. People can't buy your work, like your work, share your work. They can't commission you to do commercial work if they don't know you exist.
Right.
And the way you tell people to exist is on the internet. And that means the platforms.
Constantly feeding it. Like it's The more people there are, the more you have to be out there, the more like this is a struggle that
Right.
my clients, most of whom are introverts, not all of them, but would be self-described introverts, are just like, oh, like they just cringe at the thought of having to be louder than the next person, and I don't want them to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think you're going to be much more of an expert than I am in terms of the really specifics of how you deal with these situations and how
Yeah.
you work with your own sort of personality. But yes, I mean, the artists I talked to all talked about how they've accepted this as a necessity, but it's really a lot, it drains energy, it drains soul, it breaks up your time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
artists need kind of an amount like an amount of time that feels endless, right?
Yeah.
You can't really create with a clock ticking. So to find the time, to find the uninterrupted time, to be able to sink into your work, to sink into your flow, is hard. Is really hard under these circumstances. Yeah.
I really liked your chapter on space and time and the importance
Yes.
of having that space, literally and figuratively, to
Yes.
have just to be free, like it just to do your thing without having the pressure of turning it into a product and having to sell, but really having the time,
Right.
the endless time, as you said. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk a lot in the book about the relationship between art and the arts and money. There's some really fascinating discussions about it. Um, I don't even know where to start with this, but maybe your chapter on art history and the three paradigms. Can we talk about those?
Oh, sure. I would love to.
Yeah.
Right. So I talk at the beginning of the book. It's this. It's the first chapter after the introduction about how we need to talk about art and money, and how there's this history of not wanting to talk about money in the arts because it's selling out. It kind of corrupts your art, which isn't entirely untrue, um, but it's also really destructive because, of course, money is part of the arts because it's part of everything. And a lot of times, young creators in particular are really crippled by the fact that they're told, first of all, they're told not to think about money. And then because they're told not to think about money, they don't learn how to think about money in a way that's going to help them. So, in a later chapter that I call Art History, I talk about the history of the relationship between art and money. In some ways, that's actually where this whole project started. I mean, there was the other thing about like what's going on with, Napster, but also I was once asked to give a talk where, where they wanted me to talk about creative entrepreneurship, which is a phrase that I hate, but it made me think about like, so how did we get here? So up until really most of recorded history through the Renaissance and a little bit later, artists were artisans. In fact, the word sounds the same because they were the same. And an artisan is someone who creates a specific thing to meet a specific demand. I mean, if people know the history of Renaissance art, they know that even the greatest artists were creating from a contract that specified materials, payment, costs, everything. Um, and that does start to change in the Renaissance, where sort of artists are considered to be kind of a higher level of artisan. But it really only changes in the second, what I call the second paradigm, which I end up calling the artist as bohemian. Bohemian because I'm trying to focus on the economic condition of artists. But this is like, the 18th century, what sort of starts to happen in the late 18th century, Romanticism, the age of revolutions, the age of secularization, when most of the ideas that we still have about the artist and their role in society emerged. The artist as genius, as kind of solitary hero, as the person who sort of envisions the future, art as self-expression rather than imitation, art being founded in freedom, including freedom from political or religious ideas, right? Because, you know, in the Renaissance, you're creating for the church, you're creating for the king. You don't, artists were not truth tellers. We all think that that's the history of the arts. It's actually not true. It only starts sort of late 18th century, right? And that's when art kind of becomes a new religion in the age when the old religions are declining or being discredited, at least among sort of the most advanced people. And that's when we start this idea that art and money should be kept separate and artists should stay out of the market. And what you end up with is the bohemian, which is the person living for freedom and beauty and art on the margins of society and only engaging in the market to the extent that they have to. And in some ways that continues. In some places, maybe it still continues, although we were talking about space and time before. And what I say in that chapter is space has become too expensive, certainly in creative centers, you know, New York and so forth, for this to be possible. But even before, a long time ago, really almost a century ago, what I call the third paradigm starts to emerge. That's when we start to get MFA programs. We start to get funding organizations like the National Endowment for the Arts in the 60s, and the foundations and the residencies and the fellowships and artists teaching at universities, and a whole kind of commercial apparatus for the arts way beyond anything that existed before. So what we really have there is the artist as a professional. That's the third paradigm. And your career starts to look like a professional career. You're not a bohemian anymore. You build a resume, you sit on committees, you put your work before committees. And if you're successful enough to have a working life as an artist, and granted, there weren't a lot of people like that, you probably had a middle class existence. Like maybe not upper middle class, maybe certainly not wealthy in most cases, but you weren't the impoverished bohemian anymore. Like I said, maybe you had a teaching position at a university. Some people still have those things, and many people still aspire to it. But the internet has ushered in what I call the fourth paradigm, which is what people want to call the creative entrepreneur. And as I already said, I hate that phrase because you're not really an entrepreneur. You're not building a business that's going to have like an IPO and you're going to have, equity and you're going to start employing people. I mean, unless you're Jeff Koons or Matthew Barney, you're just going to be a one person, you're going to be the employee and you're going to be the boss. And you're going to do all the jobs in the business. And maybe you have a business structure, but fundamentally you're a single, what I really end up calling that is you're a producer. You're just in the market. No one's protecting you from the market anymore, the way they do when you're a professional. And you don't have the option of staying on the margins of the market the way you do when you're a bohemian, because for all the reasons we've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that chapter where you save the word producer till the very end, you're thinking about how you got to that point. But these last two paradigms, the professional and the producer, what I see going on with a lot of people is I do understand those two as a student of art history and former, museum professional. I understand those, but I think the mindset is still that of a bohemian.
Absolutely.
Like the market wants them to be this, but they are not that.
And this was true even in the professional era. So you have, tenured faculty at art schools who still not only still think that they're bohemians and don't want to see what their real situation is, but they're still preaching bohemianism to their students.
Yes.
Right? You're absolutely right. Like, so our ideology about the arts, our ideas about the arts, the genius, the solitary hero, the, creator uncorrupted by money is still what we have. And I mean, those are wonderful ideals, and I think they're good things to aspire to. But you also have to have a very clear understanding of what the practical, tangible financial realities are. which is one of the biggest reasons I wrote the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I love and so appreciate and so grateful to the artists that you spoke to that would talk about money and their struggles
I
with
know.
money, because it's very difficult to, it's a very vulnerable position to be in to talk about
Yes.
that. And yet it's so helpful for so many artists to hear these
Yes.
things.
I agree. Was so grateful to them. Some people said no, and I didn't interview them. Some people wanted to talk anonymously. Most people were just willing to be honest,
Yeah.
and I would ask them like specific numbers,
Yeah.
like how much do you make, how much do you pay for rent, and so many of them said, "I'm willing to expose this stuff because people didn't tell me when I was
Yeah.
starting out." It's
Yeah.
exactly the reason I just said. They wanted to help young artists.
Yeah, and they are. For anyone that reads this, they really are, because it is uh, another thing that came up repeatedly throughout the book, or at least in the parts I underlined, was how much the background of so many people in the arts to be able to afford the lifestyle of an artist. Like you, there are very few people brought up in poverty that consider the life of an artist.
Yeah, this is one of the big effects of and reasons for the fact that we don't talk about money in the arts, because a lot of people come from money and they don't want to talk about it, or maybe they married somebody or they have a partner who's supporting them, and you want to pretend that you did it yourself, or you want to pretend that you're struggling. It becomes kind of a game. And I think maybe the visual arts are worse. Maybe visual arts and documentary film are the two worst fields for this, possibly because they're the most expensive. Like, I mean, being a writer, all you need is a laptop, or maybe a pen and paper. And a musician, music can be recorded quite cheaply. But uh, if you're going to make paintings, studio space, materials are expensive. And also the education is expensive. I
Yeah.
mean, this is part of the professionalization. There's still people, who make tracks in their bedroom and become, famous recording artists who don't, maybe didn't go to college at all. But in the visual arts, I mean, because of the whole sort of, you need to get an MFA so then you can teach, or you need to get an MFA so a gallery takes you seriously. I mean, these are not problems that we can solve as individuals, but it is a huge social problem. Um, and at the very least, we need to be honest about it.
The last line of your book says, we do not, in the last two lines, we do not need the government to pay for art or the rich with their philanthropy. We only need each other.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of Pollyannish part of the book, the last chapter, where I do try to talk about how things can be made better. And it's not an easy, none of this is easy. And I mean, the hope from the beginning of Napster was that people would recognize that they should pay even if they can get things for free. Um, and, it's most people don't. But if they did, and it wouldn't have to be a lot of money. And I say in the book, if you're not an artist, or even if you are, because of course, even if we create, we're also consuming probably more than most people, all kinds of stuff. How much time in your day do you spend consuming art? And a lot of people, when they hear the word art, they think that I'm talking about museum art or gallery art or something like that. But of course, I'm talking about the arts. And that includes any kind of narrative, whether it's in a book or on Netflix or whatever, music, all kinds of visual art, murals and design and all kinds.
Design,
Well,
every,
it's really hours a day. We,
yeah.
we each spend hours a day. It's central to our lives. So we're getting all this value from artists. It really only needs to be a few $100s a year to replace what's been lost because of the platforms sucking all the money out of the arts. But that's a dream. I mean, that's not gonna, it's gonna happen tomorrow.
Say more about we need each other, because I can't remember the title of that chapter. I could find, you can maybe find, don't
Don't mourn,
mourn,
organize.
organize.
Yes.
Yeah. Say more about
I
that.
stole that from someone. Well, part of the way to understand that is that making art is a very individual thing, right? And so people tend to just think, this is my thing, and that's understandable. But I talk in that chapter about someone I talked with, a woman who started an organization called WAGE, Working Artists in the Greater Economy, which is all about getting getting visual artists paid by organizations they work for. And she talked about how hard it is to organize artists in the way that you would organize a worker, because artists don't want to see themselves as workers and don't want to see that their fate. I mean, there are of course exceptions, but there's it's not natural for them to think of their fate as bound up with other people's. I talked with someone else. I think my editor made me cut this because the book was already getting too long, she thought. But someone who spent a lot of time organizing like artist collectives and various kind of value sharing platforms where, instead of I pay, we each have skills that we can donate to each other, so we don't have to each pay for whatever it is, carpentry work in a studio or
It's like
something that has
trade,
nothing to do with the arts,
trading,
right?
professional trading.
Trade school.
Yeah.
It was called trade school.
Okay.
I don't think it exists anymore, unfortunately. So this is what I'm talking about. And a lot of people said to me, that when artists are in community with each other, it's a huge, not just practically, but psychologically, incredibly powerful.
It really is. I mean, this is where, I mean, you make this case about how important it is to be in a place where the arts are thriving, so that you can be where the opportunities are, learn from other artists, and so forth. This is why so many of my clients mourn being, in the sticks, in the
Yeah.
rural sticks or whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
But they're big fish in little ponds, so but it's a different lifestyle. They've just chosen a different lifestyle.
It's a catch-22, because those places that are more vibrant with big arts communities that are especially valuable for young artists to go to are the expensive cities. I mean, people forget that New York and San Francisco were not expensive until the 80s. And that's why Greenwich Village was a bohemia, and there were parts of San Francisco that were bohemia from like the very early 19th century all the way through the 70s, right? I mean, Bob Dylan was walking the same streets in the Village as Eugene O'Neill was in the 1910s. But it's not like that anymore. And the internet can provide some replacement for that, but in a lot of ways it can't. So, I remember Detroit. Everyone was talking about Detroit a few years ago, and I know some artists have moved to Detroit, but I don't really quite think it's worked out the way people thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Thought it was.
I really, just to skip back a little bit, because I missed this as part of the conversation, but I really appreciated your discussion of The Rise of the Creative Class by Richard Florida, because I read that when it came out. I haven't reread it, but you kind of gave me a quick re-education about it. But it is true. I've watched so many cities, towns, communities try to lure artists. I don't see it as much anymore. In the aughts, I saw it a lot.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, I guess that can be good. I mean, it always strikes me as extremely, I mean, I've seen some of these places. It can seem very artificial, and not really creating that kind of rich community. And what I point out in the book, and I mean, I don't think he quite realizes that he's saying this, but it's very specific. It's very clear that the artists are cities want to lure artists not because they value artists. They want to lure artists so that the artists lure the people they really value, which are the members of the creative class that are high wage professionals. Because he includes, scientific researchers and coders and architects, you know. So the artists are kind of like bike paths and and parks. Like they're an amenity.
They're bait.
They're bait. Yes. Yeah. And what that also means is that if and when cities think they can do without them, you said you haven't seen this too much since the aughts, and you made me realize that I haven't either. And a lot of things have happened since then, the crash, the pandemic, and so forth. But I also think that the actual arts have been replaced in that equation by things like food, a coffee shop, a restaurant, a food cart, or sort of creative like commerce, like a design, like a small business design shop, which are fine. I mean, I live in Portland. There's tons of this stuff there, but they're not the arts. I wrote a piece once. I think I have a little bit of this in the book, but I wrote a piece in 2012 when this stuff was still big in the New York Times that argued that, yes, food is great. This was like the height of the food thing. And I'm like, food is great, food is creative, but food isn't art. And I've never written anything, and I've written a lot of controversial things, but word for word, I don't think I've ever written anything that's gotten as much blowback.
Oh.
Because people are really invested in this idea that they are an artist. I make food, I'm an artist. I code, I'm an artist. Everybody's an artist. Well, I'm here to say that everybody isn't an artist. Starting with me. I say that at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
I'm happy to stand up proudly and say, I am not an artist, because I'm not. I'm a writer, but I'm not a creative writer. And I value what artists do and the uniqueness of what they do enough to not claim for myself or for anyone else who doesn't deserve that. And by the way, if you really are an artist, usually you're very reluctant to put that word on yourself, because you know that it's something that needs to be earned, it needs to be conquered. You have too much respect, too much esteem for it. And there's no surer sign of a dilettante or a pretender than the person who buys their first art materials on Wednesday, and by Thursday they're already announcing on Instagram that they're an artist.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your discussion of that. I appreciate your defense of artists who have earned the title artist, and who, I think in one interview you said you write non-creative nonfiction. You are not an artist. I'm not an artist. I write non-creative nonfiction.
Right.
And it's true. I mean, if everyone's an artist, then no one's an artist. And I really do believe that. I do believe that people need to earn the title. However, I think there's some of my clients that need to embrace it more, because it is their identity. And yet I understand that. I understand that world. A lot of artists who come out of graduate school say they're makers. I just make things. And I do appreciate that and honor that. And nothing makes me cringe more than artists that say they have an international reputation, or they have all this, they just have to build up their resume. And that's just such a red flag for, you're not there yet.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, because you mentioned the New York Times article, your most recent book is The End of Solitude. Is that article in that book?
Absolutely. Not only is it in the book, but I actually expand it for the book to respond to all of the negativity that I got. I respond to arguments that I got in response to that essay. It's actually the one essay in the book where I did that, because there was so much, and there's so much that I wanted to say in response.
Fascinating. I really am looking forward to reading it, because I've enjoyed this so much. And so as someone who painfully writes non-creative nonfiction herself. I would love to know on a daily basis what your reading list looks like. Like, what do you consume regularly?
Oh, I mean, I try to read literary fiction as much as I can. It's funny, I didn't realize that Rachel Kushner has a new novel that's out like this week, but the last novel I read was her third book called The Mars Room. You know, she wrote The Flamethrowers. She's terrific. And I should say, I mean, she's well into her 50s. This is only her fourth novel. She's someone and they're all about different things. So she's someone who really takes her time. And I could name, you know, other novelists that I like and other writers. I mean, I'm what I care about most is writing is whatever the topic, stuff that's written well.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm more drawn to the quality of the writing than I am to the subject.
Do you ever, as I do, get caught up in people that write beautifully and I just stop at the language and I can't, like, I just have to study how they did that sentence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's part of how you get better as a writer.
Yeah, that's very, very true. So before we go, what are you working on now?
I just started working on a book about being Jewish, which I am.
Well, that's good.
It's going to be kind of, yes, it's going to be a memoir, but it's going to be a memoir that's framed historically. So I grew up in a modern Orthodox community, and that whole thing of modern Orthodox, I think a lot of people don't understand what that is. It's not like Hasidic with the black hats and the coats, but it is observant. And, you know, so it's going to be about, you know, that childhood, but where did that world come from? And then as an adolescent and young adult, I was in a left-wing Zionist youth movement, which I think is something that's really hard for people to understand now. And that's what is that world about? And then I'm going to talk about where I took that as an adult. So different kind of book. I'm not going to compare myself to Rachel Kushner, but I like each book to be about a completely different topic in a completely different kind of book, because that's what keeps me interested.
Fascinating. When can we expect that?
Oh my God, I just started working. If all goes well, it'll come out like in 2028.
Okay.
It takes time.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for writing The Death of the Artist, even though you don't like the title. It's a great cover too. You know, it's just really...
It is a great cover.
It's a great cover. And thank you so much for writing it. I'm looking forward to more artists, even though it's been out 4 years. I know a lot of artists that don't know about this book, and I hope we reach more of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would really appreciate that.
I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with William Deresiewicz. I know that this book has just made me think so much. I know there's so many artists struggling, but now we know why. Thanks to Bill. I don't hawk a lot of books on this podcast, but I do recommend this book to almost every artist that I come across, just to know the lay of the land. So pick yourself up a copy, check it out from the library, buy it, support the artist, The Death of the Artist by Bill Deresiewicz. Check out the show notes below, my next videos. And hey, if you'd ever rather listen than watch The Art Biz, check out The Art Biz wherever you get your podcasts.